The speaker for today's panel is Mr. Heng Swee Keat, Minister for Finance, and chairing this session is Ms. Deborah Soon, Head of the Family and Premier segment at MediaCore TV. I'll now hand over to Ms. Soon to introduce the panelists for this session.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction. Our topic today is, for the final conference session, the future of we. It is a rather philosophical question, and I shall not claim any expertise in the area, as you are here also to listen to our distinguished panel of guests. So it is my duty instead to introduce them well, and as you already have their bios in the book, I'm going to try something slightly different and to introduce them in the context of how I first met them. First of all, Minister Heng Swee Keat, most of you will know that, or will remember by now, that Mr. Lee Kuan Yew had said that Mr. Heng was his best principal private secretary, the best he ever had. No pressure at all for those who followed in his shoes. For me, I remember the first time I met Mr. Heng was 20 years ago, over 20 years ago, when I interviewed him for his promotion exercise when he was still in the Singapore Police Force. He might not remember this. At the time, he was highlighted as one of the high flyers to be featured. What struck me about him then, and I'm sure is still true today, was his humility, his commitment to public service, and him thanking the men and women who worked for him to help him get where he is. Fast forward to today, as Finance Minister, it can be argued that Mr. Heng is clearly the most experienced member in the fourth generation leadership team. Having been brought into politics only in 2011 and leading the Education Ministry soon after, before handing over to two acting ministers after the most recent general election. Now, of course, Mr. Heng's abilities can be inferred by the tasks he has been given, including chairing our Singapore Conversation and the SG50 committee before the general elections, and now, more importantly, the Committee on Future Economy, which in the President's address on Friday, quoting President Tony Tan, will develop strategies to ensure that Singapore remains relevant and competitive. Emphasis purely mine. Tall order, but it's clear that the Prime Minister and the Cabinet has confidence in Mr. Heng's abilities. As for the rest of our distinguished panel, in alphabetical order, Ambassador Bilahari Kausikan, most of you will know him for his long career in the Foreign Service. He retired in 2013 as Permanent Secretary of the Ministry. He's well known for his intellect and his insightful analysis of geopolitics. Those of you who are active on Facebook will also realize, even though he was not an early adopter, he has become quite swiftly an expert with the platform. I'm sure you will agree that he never minces his words, and his views are always worth sharing, even if you may not agree with him. He has also been known to be a very colorful character with associated colorful vocabulary. My first encounter with him was when he had a short stint as the spokesperson of the Foreign Affairs Ministry and was press secretary to the minister, when I had an earful of that colorful language. One appreciates his candor in person, and perhaps even better from a distance when reading his writing. Next, Ambassador Chan Heng Chee, who needs no introduction. Having had a stellar career as an academic and a diplomat, she has been a trailblazer, not just for Singapore women, but for all Singaporeans. Many of us will remember her as the longest-serving ambassador to the United States and for the crucial role she played in improving bilateral ties between Singapore and the US. My first encounter with Professor Chan was when she was chairman of the Singapore International Foundation, again quite a while ago. She probably will also not remember me from then, but I definitely remember her. It was her ability to project her intellect, ask the most intelligent question in the room, and make the most sensible remarks, and project the uniqueness and specialness of Singapore and Singaporeans in one package, which struck and has inspired me, and I'm sure many other Singapore women. These qualities have helped Singapore and Singapore women punch above their weight internationally. Last but not least, Mr. Ho Kwon Ping, Executive Chairman of Banyan Tree Holdings and Chairman of the Singapore Management University. Distinguished corporate leader, Mr. Ho was also the first person to be awarded the S.R. Nathan Fellowship for the Study of Singapore by IPS. He helmed a series of 5 lectures on economy and business, politics, governance, society, identity, security, sustainability, and so on, which till today many people talk about. We talked about, some people mentioned them earlier. Mr. Ho is also a newsmaker, so I've had occasion to meet him at several events, but most of my interaction with him was when he was chairman of MediaCorp, which is why I'm treading very carefully. He was always very concerned about journalists and journalism. Then and now, because I infer at the very core of it, he cares about Singapore and the country's future and believes we should have frank conversations about politics and our futures, not only behind closed doors, but in public. I am more than privileged to be on this distinguished panel and do hope to facilitate a free-flowing, interesting discussion and debate amongst them before turning the floor open to you for questions. But first, without further ado, can I invite Mr. Hing to share a few words with us?
Yeah. Thank you, Deborah. You know, as Deborah made the introduction, I sank deeper and deeper into my chair with the weight of expectation that she's putting on me. And I, thank you all for staying back for this session. Even though I know this is the last session, you've already heard 3 of my colleagues, and I understand you have very interesting sessions earlier on with Yi Kang, Chi Ming, and Chun Sing earlier this morning. You know, when I was a student, if there was a session in the afternoon and I had already had 2 sessions in the morning, I usually skip the session. And the fact that all of you stayed here, I think there are only 3 possible reasons. One is really that there's an innate quality in you that wants to endure hardship and pain. Second, after hearing Deborah's introduction of our 3 eminent panelists, I think there's a very good reason for you to stay back. And I truly believe in teamwork, so if you have good questions, please ask our panelists as well. And third possible reason is that I recently met a businessman and he said, I think the economy is okay because you are still smiling. So at which point I smile a bit more and say, please take care of your business. Now, I think it's very interesting that this session is titled The Future of We. It could have been, do we have a future? But instead the session is really about the future of we. And I think that by itself is significant. That we're not talking about whether we have a future, but really what kind of future and how do we build that future? And since we're talking about the future, really the future is about change. Let me make a few brief remarks about change. What I think will not change and what I think will almost definitely change. First, what will not change? I think the facts of our existence will not change. The fact that you're a small country, you have no natural resources except our people, that you're in a region that can be volatile, that you have to abide by global forces which you have very limited ability to shape. And I think those are things which probably Heng Chi and Bilahari would agree with me. And the other aspect, which is probably less obvious but equally important, is I would say that we saw in the SG50 celebration, which is I hope that the spirit and values of our people, that quality of resourcefulness, resilience, and responsibility, I hope that will not change. In 50 years, over the next 50 years, I think the basic facts of our existence will not change. In the US, whether Detroit goes down and Palo Alto comes up, really doesn't matter for the US as a country. It means some hardship for the people, but for the US as a whole, it doesn't really matter. For us, whether Singapore stays where it is or whether things happen elsewhere, means survival for us. And you have that one city and one city-state, and that's that. And I think that fact will not change. So it does need to have an outward orientation, to think long-term and all that. I believe that that should not change. Now, what will change? Let me use the first letter of all my panelists' name to help me remember all these things which I think will change. And first, starting from Heng Chi, I think Heng Chi starts with H, and I think the word that comes close to mind is really about hopes. And I think hopes will change. The hopes and aspirations of our people will change. During the Pioneer Generation events which I held, what I found very interesting was that in the Pioneer Generation, when you ask them, describe life when you started, they all say, well, it was a very simple goal. It's a matter of survival. You don't even think too hard about it. Just do it, go and, get things done. And happy that we have food on the table. And I remember one lady who came to the tribute event at Tampines, at a community tribute event for Mr. Lee. And she described how her parents used to be Chee Chong Fan sellers in the Kurita IA area, and how during the communists, during those early days of riots which were inspired by the Communist United Front, her parents' Chee Chong Fan sauce, which had been carefully prepared overnight, over many, many hours, would just be overturned. And he said, for my parents, the hopes and dreams were very simple. We just want to survive, to be able to bring up our kids, and we'll do whatever it is. They were totally uneducated, but they were the most well-informed about what they need and what they need to do. But when I interact with our young participants in our Singapore conversation, and when I went to schools, universities, and talked to our students today, it's a completely different set of hopes and dreams. They have ideas about careers which, I've not even heard of. They want to live a life of purpose. They want to make a difference. The job is not just about earning an income. It is more than that. It is really about how do I make a difference? How do I lead a meaningful life? And I think it is a good change. It just shows how much our hopes and dreams have changed. And similarly, our seniors are very different. We are going to have 900,000 seniors in 2030 by 2030. And that, I think, will be a generation that's very different and will change. I recently watched a program on Channel News Asia on the hip-hop grannies in China. And it was really fascinating to see these grannies doing hip-hops with their teenagers. So, I can't quite imagine Heng Chi doing hip-hop, maybe, but certainly she can do a lot of mental hip-hops. And I think, can you imagine? I mean, it's a very different set of hopes and aspirations, even for people in a different age. So hopes and dreams will change. Second, if I turn to Bilahari, Bilahari has been spending all his life protecting our borders and building bridges across borders, and he's now called Ambassador at Large. I don't know whether it's because we can't find him or whether he's going all over the place.
Larger than life, maybe.
But if you look at the borders, if you look at national borders, how it has changed. Even for terrorism, when we talk about the wilayat that ISIS is seeking to establish, it is truly across borders. If you look at how ICT has completely changed our notion of what it means to be a national business. You look at e-commerce. During this year's Double 11 sales by Alibaba, Singapore was ranked 5th highest in the Alibaba sales. So billions of dollars of sales. If you are operating a retail store, you would not expect that a Chinese company, you would not expect 10 years ago that a Chinese company called Alibaba would be cannibalizing your business. And so how ICT has really changed the borders. 2 days ago, I was in Beijing for the AIIB, the establishment of the AIIB. 57 ministers and senior officials, or rather, ministers and senior officials from 57 countries attended that event. One minister pulled me aside and said, wow, what a change. in just a few years, China has the power to command these 57 members, including some of the biggest countries in Europe, in Central Asia, in Asia, even Africa, Latin America. And when you think about it, it was significant that he made that remark about change and how, during the Asian financial crisis, I was in the Prime Minister's office, and we're talking about how China was making this transition and how, all the difficulty that he went through. And now China is saying that I'm going to put money on the table, we're going to set up AIIB, and the rest of you please join us and let's work to develop the region. So borders, whether it's across the world, whether it's across business, or even across disciplines in our study, will change. And that change, I think, will have profound effect on what we do. Now, the third area of change, and here I've turned to Kwon Ping. Kwon Ping starts with K, and I think K reminds me of kinship. And Kwon Ping has also done a lot of work in SMU, trying to not just develop a sense of kinship in SMU, but also getting SMU students to do social work, to do community projects, to really make them feel that they are a part of Singapore, that they have to contribute to the well-being of other people. Now, I think our societies will become more diverse, and the affiliation and the sense of identity will also change. I think you're going to have Singaporeans with very multiple affiliations and so on. But when you look back at our founding ideals and why we became an independent nation to begin with, is that this sense of identity, this sense that regardless of race, language, or religion, is really the critical part of our founding ideals. When you think about that colonial struggle and what happened, the people at that period of time had basically a few options. Either go back to the countries that they came from, or seek to develop a different society in Southeast Asia. And Mr. Lee and his team decided that they would try to build a multiracial nation out of plural groups of people, immigrants coming from different parts of the world. And I would say that over 50 years, I think this sense that regardless of race, language, or religion is now quite well embedded, but it's quite well embedded in our society, but it is always a work in progress, and it's something that we must never forget. And indeed, we will find new sources of differences, be it socioeconomic status, be it wealth, be it beliefs, be it interests, and so on. And really it's not so much a change per se, but really it's my hope that this sense of kinship will remain strong in our society. And finally, Deborah, since you start with D, and Deborah is always associated with dialogue and debates and so on, I'll turn to Deborah and say really, it's really more about dialogues. I tell you that I personally don't, between debates and dialogue, I far prefer dialogue, because I think you can get deep into an issue, you can surface assumptions that we have, we can go deep into a conversation and try and reach something positive. And I would say that we must go even beyond that. That it's not just about talking, it's about how we can agree on certain action, how we can then work together to achieve what we hope to do. So those are the four changes. And if you think about it, essentially, when we talk about how hopes could change, it's really an internal wish list. That each of us has a hope, has our dreams, have aspirations, we hope you'll change. If we talk about borders, it's really about what happens outside us, what happens around the world, and how global forces will continue to shape a small little island state. And when we talk about dialogues, when we talk about kinship, it is really the glue that binds, that gives us a sense that we are one people, that we need to have this sense of togetherness, and to have this sense of care and concern for one another that will enable us to build a better society, to build a better future together, that we are in this together. And finally, it is not just each of us expressing our wish and dreams, but it is how feeling that sense of kinship that we can come together to do things together, to develop deeper understanding and trust with one another, to see how, for example, the things that we do in our Singapore conversation, in SG50, and now in the Future of Us exhibition, can allow us to achieve that common understanding and that collective will to do things together. So when we talk about the future of us, I think the future really, at the end of the day, is for us to shape, to not just by one or two persons, but really by all of us together. It is a collective endeavor. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Could I just ask the first question, that when you talk about race, language, and religion and change, and that these are core principles which should not change, do we not acknowledge that there are global forces, particularly on religion, in front of conservatism across the globe, which have already affected us here? How do we deal with these forces of change? How will they affect us as we try to develop kinship? Perhaps you first, and then I'll open out to the panelists.
Yeah. Well, I think there will always be differences in our society, and what I think is very important is that when it comes to matters of religion, it is not possible for, it is not something that you can empirically falsify. Unlike a scientific hypothesis, you say, well, I'm going to do this is correct and this is wrong because I can prove it. You can't. This is the nature of faith. I don't think, therefore, when it comes to dialogue, that it will make a that it will be productive for us to say, well, let us debate whether your God is truer than my God. I don't think that's possible. But what is possible is to make sure that we find as much common points of reference as possible, and that we create platforms for different religious groups to come together to work on things that they can agree on and develop a degree of trust. So that's the first thing. Second, I think many people would agree that sometimes religions can be subverted for other purposes. And it is important that we are vigilant towards that. And those believers who feel that the religion has been subverted, that you have a more extreme form that does not respect other religion, that does not give space to other religion, and that's something which people of that faith will have to act on, and to make sure that it does not become a source of conflict, because it will bring it will bring certainly conflicts, and it will bring a range of issues which will be very hard to deal with once it unravels.
Prof. Chan, could I ask you to jump in there, please?
Thank you, Deborah. Race, language, religion. These are primeval forces. And I would say that the history of Singapore from colonial times till now has been really trying to manage race, language, and religion, and the development of a multiracial, multilingual, multi-religious, multicultural policy. I think we've done reasonably well so far. We can say we live in racial harmony. We can say, there is racial peace, far more than you see what's happening in Baltimore, Ferguson. Is a very different picture now. We had 9/11 in Singapore, and we discovered the JI network. And yet, in spite of that, I think the Muslim community does not feel targeted the way they are elsewhere. And we've worked hard at it. And keeping this harmony still requires work. I think we cannot say that we've got it, we've reached a stage of integration, we're getting on reasonably well. Because if you don't keep managing and working at these issues, things can fall apart.
Well, actually, the context of my question was because recently the religious right have been protesting against, for instance, the inclusion of Adam Lambert in the Countdown Party. In addition to that, I think the MDA is dealing with the issue of Madonna's concert in Singapore, and that religious conservatism has kind of narrowed the common space we have here. Would Mr. Ho like to jump in there or respond to, make a comment on that?
Well, could I actually bring up a different topic instead? This is a very important one, but I guess my perspective is that when we discuss the future of Singapore, I think there's a general agreement that whatever that future is going to be, it's going to have to involve an increasingly active civil society. I think that everyone is well aware of. And one of the things that I encountered during my time having to be the S.R. Nathan lecturer was I tried to speak to many people in civil society, and of course people had many different views, very different views, but one common view that came about, and it's something I'd like to ask Minister. Incidentally, just to make sure that there's no added pressure to you, sir, many people have said that this is a beauty parade of future prime ministers, and Mr. Heng happens to be the front runner. No pressure, sir, no pressure. And if this were in America, we would be asking each one of the speakers today, what is it that you're going to do that differentiates you from your competitor and your predecessor? But we are in Singapore. We're very united. We all speak with one tongue. But nevertheless, I think I've been asked to ask you something quite specific. And I think it's an issue that is quite burning for many members of civil society, whether it be academia, whether it be lobby groups, whether it be animal rights groups, or whatever. And the concern they seem to have, regardless of their perspective, is this whole issue of information access. You're well aware of that, and it's been spoken about by other people, complaints being made that we're not even talking about confidential information or restricted information, but general access to information from the bureaucracy, the civil service, and so on. And it's been proposed that having a Freedom of Information Act is too radical for Singapore, but one proposal was that other countries seem to have a code of conduct for government civil servants, a code of conduct whereby essentially it sets out as a code of conduct, not as a legal document as much as the Freedom of Information Act, but a code of conduct whereby, except for specific circumstances regarding security and so on, all information should be made easily available to the public. And the sense I got from many groups I spoke to was that they feel that information is a lifeblood of dialogue and of civil society. So the question I pose to you, sir, is what would you do as future Prime Minister about information access? Would you approve such a bill, sir?
Your question is so hypothetical, I don't think I have to answer it now. But in a spirit of answering the essence of your question, not the implication of the question. First, on your point about civil society's interest in doing their part for Singapore. In fact, one of the things which I've said on many occasions is that really as our society becomes more diverse and as our people become better educated, it is an opportunity for us to harness that energy and creativity of all Singaporeans to build a better Singapore. It is not possible for government agencies to do everything, to know everything, and nor do we have the monopoly of all the good ideas. And one of the things, for instance, so in the Committee on the Future Economy, one of the things which I intend to do is to consult as widely as possible to get as many points of view as possible. And at the end of it, of course, we then have to debate the pros and cons. There will be groups that will be proposing A versus B and so on. And some groups will be winners, some groups will be losers. And government, as the arbitrator, will have to think about what we have to do for the long term, for the good of all our people. So I think that there are lots of avenues for people to participate in meaningful dialogues. I recently received a report from the SBF, and SBF has, on its own initiative, in fact, more than 6 months ago, gotten all its members together and put up an excellent report, very thoughtful report on what we need to do. And as I said before, I was most impressed by the fact that although businesses have to worry about quarterly results and short term and so on, more than 2/3 of the recommendations were about the medium term and the long term. And I think that is the quality of involvement which I hope they will get. The people are not just looking at what is in it for me or my business, but really how can we collaborate, enlarge the pie, and take care not just of today but tomorrow. And I think that is something to be very much encouraged. When I did OSC, I structured in such a way that it was completely open-ended. In fact, my colleagues were quite shocked at that. They said, are you sure you can conduct a dialogue where you just ask Singaporeans to come together and talk about their aspirations and their hopes and dreams for the future? I said, well, you have to start from there, because I don't want to set up first subcommittee on ABCDE and then to direct the dialogue in a particular direction. I really want to hear from fellow Singaporeans what mattered to you most. And what was most encouraging out of this OSC was how many points of convergence there were. And I think we need to have the confidence that Singaporeans are thoughtful, reasonable people, and that we should engage as deeply as possible. And what came out of it too was that a lot of them came up to me and said, gee, I didn't realize that other people have perspectives that are so different from mine. So from that point of view, I believe that civil society in Singapore, while they are set up for particular causes, or to advocate particular causes, or they have particular areas of interest, should always do this not so much with a view of just narrowly advocating a particular set of interests. I mean, even if you're interested in animal rights, I think one needs to consider the interests of people who may have issues with safety and so on. So it is really that balance we need in our society, and I'm quite confident that as we become, as we are more engaged in the process of dialogue, we will deepen that understanding within our society and across the different parts of society. Now, specifically on your point about information being, whether it should be made more readily available, I can confess to you that even as finance minister, I don't get all the information I want. I sometimes ask, I say, how come I don't get the analysis on this? And either the information is not collected, or some departments say, no, but this is not relevant to the Ministry of Finance. Yeah. And I do think that as a society, we need to be better at using data. We need to be better at looking at how we can have more data-driven policy making and data-driven work. But having said that, this has been raised from time to time, and when I look at I don't know how many of you have seen the Department of Statistics website, and it's a whole range of interesting information that one could make fairly a good use of, even just whatever that is available. So if there are, and as we embark on the Smart Nation project, as we look at, not only will the amount of data that government they'll be collecting and putting out be increasing, but actually many private sector players are putting out lots of those data. SMU, for instance, you have a data analytics project, and those are data which nobody has ever collected, and which SMU will be doing with regards to the confidentiality of individuals and so on, which will give us very interesting results. So I think if our question is, how do we be more data-driven in our policy making, in the way we think about issues, in the way we run businesses and so on, I would say that certainly the government will be providing more in those areas in the coming years, but also I think it's not just about the government, it's also about what the private sector can do and what we can do to make use of those data.
Bilahari, would you like to jump in there? Do you think we need a Freedom of Information Act, and whether or not we should be revealing all to the public and to civil society?
Let me go back to your first point of entry about race, language, and religion. I agree with Heng Chi. These are primordial things. They're never going to go away entirely. They will morph, but they will always be there. And one of the tools for dealing with it in a multiracial society is you need a state that is strong enough to be a neutral arbiter among different races, different religions, different confessions. That is absolutely vital. But the problem in much of the world is that the state is too weak, or the state has handicapped itself, especially in the so-called first world. I think, by the way, as a side, we should get rid of this narrative from third world to first. We know we have gone there. But that is no longer a good benchmark for the next phase, because if you look at the first world, many of them are extremely dysfunctional. So the point is not to be mired in the same problems, but how to go. And one of the problems, if you look, you see in Europe, they are incapable of dealing with extremism in religion, because they have, not because the state is a failed state, because they are also in, they are functional states, but they have handicapped themselves by their own ideologies. Now, that is perhaps related not so much to freedom of information, but to a broader question, which I was going to ask the minister, but I ask it now anyway. When you talked about what will not change, will not change. And I agree with you, absolutely. How can I not agree with you? Because I spend most of my life dealing with that, right? But Minister, I hope you know, that a substantial amount of your population is not going to believe you. I don't mean people in this room. I hope. I don't mean people in this room. But your broader audience, many of them, a substantial amount, I mean, there's no way to quantify it, but I believe so, are going to see this as just another ploy to keep the PAP government in power. And so, when the President, in his address, spoke about the need for good politics, the need to refresh our system to continue to have good politics, the question arises, what is good? What is the benchmark? And I don't think the first world necessarily provides all the benchmarks. I think we will have to chart our own course, and I'd like to know what is your vision for that course. Thank you. A simple question.
Related to the Prime Minister and the vision.
Well, thank you, Bilahari, for that question. First of all, I can't agree with you more that our benchmark, especially when it comes to managing social, even economic and political issues, should not be, the so-called first world. It's not as if that there was that gold standard which we must all strive towards. I've always believed that every society must decide for itself what is it that it wants, what are the challenges that it faces, what are the circumstances in which they are in, and then have their courage and conviction to figure out how do we get there. And then, and of course, a very critical element of it is to have a population that who believe that this is the way to go. So if we take that approach, that is why I mentioned that what is it that we will change and what will not change. And the reason why I outline what are the things that will not change, the circumstances that we are faced with and so on, and the examples which I gave of how, if you look at 10 years ago, people will not be, 15 years ago, people will not be talking about China convening an AIIB and so on. In fact, during the Asian financial crisis, we're talking about, oh dear, what will happen to China and so on. So things changed very quickly, and we got to figure out for ourselves what is it that we need to do and do differently, because you are in the part of Asia, you face a set of imperatives within this region, and if we blindly adopt methods used elsewhere, we are going to be in trouble. And the circumstances will always change, and you have to find new ways of doing things. In preparing for my budget, I read one of Dr. Goh's earlier budget speech that was way back in 1967. And it was a fascinating speech because I wanted to understand what were the circumstances that we were faced with then, what did we do, and how did we get out of it. Not because there are things that, not because there are specifics of policy that will be helpful today, but rather I wanted to glean the spirit of that problem solving. What is it that it was done? And interesting that Guan Ping asked about data. There was actually a lot of very good data that was produced that was sufficient for us to analyze what the problems were and what we need to do. So I think we need to really figure out what are the changes that are going to happen around us. Now, unfortunately, and I agree, Bilahari, that sometimes people get very cynical and said, oh, But here again, Mr. Heng is talking about all these vulnerabilities and smallness and so on. So let me say two things about that point. First of all, I think we will be very unwise to ignore that these are facts that we have to confront. And however difficult it is to get the message across, I think it is part of our responsibility in the leadership, and in fact all of you here, to go out and talk about this, because these are things which empirically you could either say this is all a whole load of rubbish, or that you can come up with fairly reasoned analysis and say, indeed, those are the facts of life. And I believe that if you talk to business people, they will understand what it is. With a good tripartite system, I believe that our workers will understand what is it that we need to do. In fact, the union have actually brought some of our workers to go around the world, including China, to see the enormous changes that have taken place. And the second reason why I think we need to talk about that is that if we, it is not to just focus our mind on the fact that we are small, the fact that we don't have natural resources and all that. In fact, I mention it for opposite reason, that we should really think hard about how to turn the fact of smallness to unique value and relevance to the world. How do we turn the fact that we are without natural resources to build a unique advantage? I think all of you are familiar with the water story and how we overcame the constraints. I believe that we are going to be able to make an impact in education, in how we educate our young people, in how our universities are structured, how our poly, ITE, and now Skills Future are structured. Because when we recognize a problem and not deny it, we can be innovative, we can be creative about things, we can do far more than if we pretend that the problem doesn't exist. Similarly, the fact of our smallness can be turned into advantage even in foreign affairs. Why is the Shangri-La Dialogue held in Singapore, where major powers convene here? Because we are small and we are non-threatening, and therefore we can play a nice neutral role. Yesterday, I hosted 21 Nobel laureates and technology prize winners at SUTD. I asked them, what made you come to Singapore? I mean, we are a very small place, and to have this team of very eminent scientists. And they said, well, precisely because you are small, you have to do things quite differently. And this is one of those few conferences where you bring people from different disciplines together, across borders, across boundaries of discipline, and we find it very stimulating. And therefore, I think by recognizing where we are and what are the constraints, we are in a better position to transcend it and to do something really creative about it. Now, on your question about what is good politics, how do I regard it? Let me share that not recently we had a discussion among a whole group of ministers about a major infrastructure project. And the major infrastructure project is divided into many different phases. The first phase will not come on until at least 15 years from now. And the last part of it, if we want to have the option to do better, will not take place until another 30, 40 years from now. I had taken part in the discussion in a very matter-of-fact way. This is what we should be thinking about, and so on. And until a colleague of mine, a public servant who was involved in the discussion, said, this is surreal, If you don't mind me saying, none of you are going to be alive. And here you are talking about this. Don't you understand that a week in politics is a long time? And here you are talking about projects for Singapore over this long period of time when none of you will be alive. And that's why it hit me. I said, yes, indeed. I took it as such a matter of course that we are in it to protect to advance the long-term interests of Singapore, to think about the generations of Singaporeans, those who are here with us and those who are not even born yet. And I believe strongly that ought to be an instinct. Second, I think the other instinct is that we need to really understand the world and what are the changes which are happening around us if we are going to help to navigate this small place. And third, as I said in my remarks, we, as our society becomes more better educated, more diverse, we have a lot more knowledge and expertise and energy and creativity out there. And we got to find better ways in which we can harness that energy and creativity of our people to do great things together. But that starts from the dialogue, from having a common understanding. And that is why I have been so passionate about the Singapore conversation and about the Future of Us exhibition and in a way that we are going to do the Committee on the Future Economy. Because I think you'll be dumb, right, if I were to say, this is what I know and this is how I'll decide, and that's that. Because at the end of the day, all these changes that we have to make in our society, whether it is a big macro policy or whether it is about how you develop the community, has to come from our people. And I'm very happy that, as an MP on the ground, I have, over the last 4.5 years, 5 years, met so many groups of residents who now come together to do really interesting things together. It need not be very highbrow stuff and great debates of policy and politics and all that. It could just be really simple thing. I share with you one which I'm so impressed. A group of my residents came together and said, we have quite a number of aged people in our area, and we have all these void decks in this area. This is a lovely void deck. Can we use this to set up a neighbor's corner? And I say, yeah, why not? So can you support us? I say, what do you need? Well, just give us the space, and I need some basic facilities, and give us, some small amount of raw materials for us to cook. I said, well, that sounds easy enough. And then someone else came and volunteered and said, I'm happy to donate a TV, I'm happy to do this, I'm happy to donate tables and chairs, and I'm happy to do that. And today, there's a whole group of elderly from their late 60s to 70s and some in their 80s who come together to cook for one another. They have breakfast there every day. There was a great spirit of neighborliness, and those are the things that we should all promote. So I'm saying that the range of participation in what we do is really, really very wide and diverse, and that the needs in our society will grow, and it is that sort of energy and care and concern for others is really what we must continue to promote. So on the one level, we need to make sure that internationally, whether it's in foreign policy, whether it's in our defense, whether it's in our economic policy, that we are able to keep pace with the world. And on another level, that what we do internally, that you have to build that sense of togetherness, and that can be done through a whole variety of interesting ways. It doesn't have to be, just in one or two specific areas.
Thank you, Minister. We have time for one more question from the panel. Would any of you want to jump in? Prof. Chan.
Since it takes a long time to come back to the beginning, I will ask two questions at the same time. They have to do with political changes. Now, the title of this session is The Future of We. And we implies subject, active, as opposed to the future of us, which is object. Things happen to us. Things are done to us. Things are done for us, but we will do this. You are going to have a much more active citizenry, Minister. We talked about the role of CSOs. I think the question I have here is, will there be a change, a re-examination of political style going forward for the next 50 years, not the last 50 years, that things will be less top-down, leadership will be less top-down, but the government will let things float from bottom. White space allowing citizens to decide what they want to do, and really full engagement with civil society. That's the first question. The second question has to do with the titillating speech during the opening of Parliament by the President. He spoke of political changes to the political system. And so I asked myself, what changes are we thinking of? Is it to the constituencies, to the GRCs? Is it to the elected presidency? And I think today, Kishore Mahbubani had an article on the elected presidency. So are we thinking of anything along those lines? I must confess, I was never a fan of the elected presidency because it really confuses the electorate. We are a prime ministerial system and we grafted the elected system. And some of the candidates of the last elected presidential election thought they were going to be fully empowered, but it is not. This is a prime ministerial system with cabinet responsibility. So that's very confusing. But I think what I felt the elected presidency did was that it gave less of an opportunity for the minorities to really take, occupy the seat of the presidency when you have a national electorate. So it's a pity that, we cannot rotate to the different ethnic minorities the way we used to in the past by appointment. So my question is, the political changes, are you changing political style substantially? And second, what's going to happen to the elected presidency?
Well, Heng Chi, thanks for your question. First, on your first question about whether the stance will change. Actually, I would say that if you look at the government, the stance has been changing over the years. When I was starting my work on the Singapore Conversation, I look back at all the previous consultations that we did, from the next lab to the various sessions that were done over the period of time, and you notice that, in fact, every few years there were some of these changes, and I think most people would agree that Mr. Goh Chok Tong had a very different style from Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, and PM has a very different style too. And in fact, if at all, I would say that the trend has been towards increasing openness and participation, and I believe for a very good reason, which is that there is, as we are able to build a better common understanding of how we secure our collective interests and how do we enable our people to be able to fulfill their potential, I think the greater confidence and trust that's been built up over time allows us to do a lot more of this. And I would stress that the important thing is that we start, as I mentioned earlier, not from a very narrow interest-based politics or a narrow identity-based politics, because I think that will be negative for Singapore. Could potentially even be destructive. And you look at what is happening in many systems around the world, where politics is really based on a contest of different groups, and one group will start, setting up lobby of one form and another, and in the end, the political process does not allow it to take into account the interests of as many people as possible, because it's really a function of how much money you can raise to lobby what particular cause, and I don't think that would be good for Singapore. Now, would it be consultative across many things and so on? I would say it really depends on the subject matter. If you're dealing with a subject on our security, on terrorism, I don't think it's something that one would say, let me consult before I make an arrest. I think you just got to be very decisive about it and say that's that. That as long as there's a proper due process, where there are serious infringements of the law, I don't think we want that to be open to consultation and discussion. But on the other hand, if you're talking about how do we ensure that we can better safeguard ourselves from terrorism, that is something that will benefit from a better airing of views. To build that consensus in our society that we wouldn't allow this to happen here. If it happens, we have a way to respond, and we have a way to make sure that it does not tear apart our social fabric. Then that will be important. On your question about changes and your comments on the elected president, our political institutions will have to evolve with the times. But what should not change is that we must continue to have clean, effective governments that can take Singapore forward. That you are able to have a system that is not gridlocked, that is mired in interest-based politics. That, I think, must continue. But at the same time, as our population becomes more diverse, it is important that the voices of different groups of people and the voices of the minority in particular are heard and adequately represented in our system. So I would not want to prejudge how the discussion will go. I think the President has mentioned that we will continue, this will be a time for us to discuss. The government will study this, and there will be discussions on this topic. And I hope that, in fact, the last few days, I noticed that there's been a number of interesting opinions which have been aired. As to the question of the confusion between the President and the fact that ours is a prime ministerial system, indeed there is the risk of that. But I do personally think that the elected presidency is an important institution for the function of stabilizing our system. That you can never predict how election results will come out, and it has a role in providing a certain stability. Again, really acting in the long-term interest of Singapore. The question is, how do we ensure that remains relevant, and how do we minimize any potential negatives from having a system like that? But let me add that apart from political institutions, I think the political culture in our country is also very important. I recently visited a country in our region as a tourist, and so during that trip I took many cab rides. I had a chat with many different people, including people on the street, and I said, you have a very interesting set of debates in your parliament, and sometimes it gets a little unruly. And then I was quite astonished when someone said, yeah, but that is our political culture. Actually, it's quite entertaining. And I said, but surely Parliament is not a place to be entertained. It is for serious debate. And I said, well, what to do? It has become like that. I don't think we want to get there. That I think we got to maintain a certain expectation of our political leaders, of members of Parliament, that there's a certain decorum and a certain seriousness of purpose in our Parliament. And that, I think, can only come from the expectations of our people. That this is a kind of political culture that we want. Similarly, when we talk about whether it's NGOs or other groups, if we are people who stand up and say no, I think I would not just narrowly advocate what is good for me, but I really think about the interests of other people. That creates a very different political culture. And it's important that we guard that and that we don't end up, like in the case of the US, where the parties have become more and more polarized because the nature of the election, the nature of the TV and all that there's just a lot of grandstanding, and people will tell you in private that actually I don't believe in what I just said, but I had to say it because the TV is there and all that, and that I think is very dysfunctional. And I hope that we maintain a certain seriousness of purpose in our political life.
Thank you very much, Minister. I would like to now open the floor to questions. There are many mics around. If you can make your way to the closest mic near you and introduce yourself, be very helpful. Gentleman in front. Zainul, if you could proceed to the mic.
Thank you, Deborah. I have a very provocative question, but if you don't mind, I'd like to make a humble request first before that. It's a little unconventional and inconvenient, but if you allow, and Janada's allow the Minister, I'd like to request that all of us stand up and say the pledge. Is that too much to ask? Since it's been repeated time and time over the whole of today, why don't we all stand up and say the pledge?
China does. Your conference.
I think Janada shall lead the pledge.
Yeah, you don't know. Then
Oh, I guess that
In
means
the nature of collective action, how many of you say yes to Zainu's request?
Nobody.
Oh, nobody's
Actually, maybe we should ask a negative question. How many people say no? Then since their hands are down, then we should all stand up.
That's the point. How can we say no to the pledge?
So yes, Jan does. Once you stand up, everybody in the room will stand up.
I don't know how many non-Singaporeans are here. I hope they won't mind.
I'm sure this is to illustrate a point. So, no.
He wants us to
Janadas?
stand up.
Okay,
I think
maybe
we,
you want to ask
I
the
think we should be
question,
asking
then we do it
questions, lah.
together, yes.
Not making gestures.
Never mind that. Never mind. I was just
I
testing.
mean,
My provocative question is, I know much has been said about harmony, and also thanks for a reminder by Heng Chi that this is work in progress. So I'd like to ask this question. How many of us, how many of you still think that the Malay Muslim community is the weakest link for our Singapore? There's a lot of question marks, challenges, Daesh, IS, developments in the world, developments in the region in terms of race politics in our neighboring countries, with possible challenges to us. Do we still think of the Malay Muslims in Singapore as the weakest link? We, the Muslims in Singapore and Malay Muslims in Singapore, see ourselves as a source of strength for what we can contribute towards the greater wellness of Singapore, the future we. And we hope this will echo not in this room, but the whole of Singapore, not only today, but forever. Of course, it depends on the Malay Muslims themselves. They have to show that they are indeed strength as part of our multiracial, multi-religious Singapore. Thank you.
Thank you, Zainal. Very difficult question. Minister, would you like to take that on?
Well, thank you, Zainul. I would like to share with you one session which I attended. This was interreligious organization. It was a forum about religion. And what was most remarkable for me in that particular forum was that when a bishop stood up and said, today we spoke about extremist views, and I want, as a Christian, to make clear that extremist views can affect any religion and in fact in any of our beliefs. It is not targeted at any particular religion. And I was so cheered by that remark. So I think, in the nature of such discussion, it is important indeed for us to understand that anything, any of these comments, any belief system pursued to its extreme can become subverted, can become a source of problem for others. And I think therefore I kept mentioning that this respect that we have for different points of view is important, and this sense of kinship that we need to have in our society. Because if you do, then you try and enlarge the common space and the understanding. So I don't think that we should associate, just as a matter of instinct, that when we talk about external development and all that, it'll be about this. We just have to look at where the sources of problems are and how it might affect us. When we talk about global and regional development, bear in mind that I mentioned about how, for instance, the internet and the ICT and even e-commerce can completely disrupt our business. All our businesses in Singapore, if we don't prepare for it, can also be disrupted. So whether it's a matter of economics or politics or racial relations, developments outside us can affect us, and we've got to be quite clear about how that might be transmitted. And if we understand that, I think we are in a better position to guard against that.
Would any of you like to respond to that question, Bilhari?
no.
Anybody else on the floor would like to ask questions? After Zainal's rather difficult question, nobody wants to ask something else? Rather unbelievable. Would the panelists like to ask a question?
One hand at the,
Yes. Gentleman at the back.
Hi, my name is Faris. I run a social enterprise that promotes inclusivity of communities. But basically, I would like to respond to Encik Zainal's comments, as well as provide feedback to the Minister with regards to the engagement of minorities, in particular the Malay Muslim community. I understand that every single month we collect different income from each of every Singaporeans to help CDAC, SINDA, but for Muslims, it actually goes to the Mosque Building Fund, and slightly a little bit goes to Mendaki. So why not? We realize that the problem that we face with a community that perhaps is classified as a weak link, unfortunately, is that we do not have a Malay Muslim intermediary, which is similar to the concept of CDAC, Eurasian Association, or SINDA. So in other words, the income that we collect from the Malay Muslim community goes to actually Mosque Building Fund, goes to religion, while the challenges that we face are a racial challenge. So perhaps what's needed is an intermediary to help the community groups, the many MMOs out there, to help themselves. So perhaps the channeling of this finance will then help social issues. That's the first feedback. The second one is, since now it's SG 51, and I understand last year we increased tax deductibles to Institute of Public Characters of 300%. Perhaps we can increase it a little bit more to promote more civil activism as well as greater community help. So those are my two comments in response to Encik Zainal.
Thank you, Faris, for your questions.
Okay.
First one on Mosque Building
Yeah,
Fund.
Faris, can I ask what does a social enterprise do?
Social creatives.
Social?
Creatives.
Social
Creatives.
What's that?
We do legal vandalism. Basically, we rally people to come together to paint at different locations, whether it's at Institute of Mental Health, orphanages, void deck art galleries,
I see.
and recently at Resorts World.
Oh, okay, that's very interesting. Thank you. Yeah. Well, so I hope you found that to be an interesting and meaningful thing to do. First, let me comment on your Mendaki Fund and all that. In fact, with the formula for this contribution were revised some months back. I don't remember the details. But let me say that in terms of helping the different groups in Singapore, it's not just the Mendaki Fund. When I was Minister for Education, I raised the bursaries for students across all races quite significantly. And we had programs for leveling up, primary school. We started at P1 and P2, and then I moved it up all the way to P6 and all the way to secondary school. So it is not just specific pots of fund that are earmarked for a particular purpose. It is one has to take into account the entire approach that we have. And for me, education remains very much a critical enabler of progress. We've got to make sure that no child is left behind because of family circumstances. Now, on your comment about SG 51 and whether we should have more funding for IPC and all that, I have to commend the team who did this SG 50 Care and Share program. They raised a large amount of funds for the Care and Share program. Lots of people really put in lots of effort. I'm sure many of you here in this room have donated in one way or another to that. And what is important for us now is to make sure that we can use those funds as effectively as possible. And I do encourage that for different groups to come together and to look at how we can maximize the impact of those funds. But as to your specific suggestion, that's something that have been studied in the budget. I won't say anything about the budget at this moment.
Any more questions from the floor? Actually, Mr. Heng preempted my question. I was going to ask what inclusive measures would you be including in this year's budget to create more kinship among Singaporeans?
You see, that's something which is interesting. I think that it is useful in some areas to create things like that, but in other areas, it can actually not be the most helpful. And I do think that, when I talk about the kinship spirit, I hope that it goes beyond just what the government can do in financial terms, but really it is a much broader concept which I hope everyone embraces.
Deborah, can we ask?
Yes,
Can we ask, since there's another question, if there's no question from the floor? Well, Mr. Heng, Minister, as Kwong Ping said, this is a beauty contest, and you are who you are. So let me ask you this question. What is your most optimistic scenario for Singapore in 10 years' time? And what is your not so optimistic scenario for Singapore in 10 years?
Well, I don't think in terms of what is the most optimistic or what is the most pessimistic in that sense, but I do think in terms of where I hope we will be in 10 years' time. And we can talk about a whole range of things relating to the economy and our position in the world and so on. But I would say that at the end of the day, what matters most to me is our people and the relationships among our people. So first let me talk about our people. I think I would like to see Singaporeans having that, as I said earlier, this sense of kinship, having that sense of care and concern for one another, having that self-confidence to make breakthroughs, having that spirit to have that, to have that entrepreneurial spirit, that innovative spirit, to take whatever that may come our way, because we can't predict how the world will be, but we can manage ourselves. We can develop that steel in us, we can develop that quality in us to say, whatever it is, we will stick together and we will figure out our way out. And that this care and concern that cuts across language, race, religion will be a part of the Singapore DNA. And I think if we have that spirit in us, we can do many things together, we can achieve many things together. And I cannot predict what we can do together, because if we are really truly creative about it, many of the things that we do will surprise us. Like for instance, when we embarked on the R&D efforts, we don't expect what will happen, that I'm able to predict in a certain number of years this is what will happen. But that was what happened. When we embarked on expanding our universities, we now produce students who are a lot more knowledgeable about the world, who are able to solve a lot more problems, who are traveling the world. And I think if we focus on people, we will not go very wrong. That we will be able. Now, the other aspect of it is really the quality of the relationships of our people. I've always been very troubled when I look around the world how societies don't fulfill their potential or the potential of their people. Either they are spending all the time fighting issues, whether it's a sectarian issue, whether it is political gridlock and so on. And the people who suffer are the common man, the man in the street. And I find that very troubling. And I hope that we don't get there. And also you find that in many societies, over a period of time, groups formed, and you end up with all sorts of groups which then become very entrenched and they want to fight for their interests. But if we are able to structure our society in a way that allows groups to interact, to mingle, to support one another, to do meaningful things together, we will be in a far better position to fulfill our potential as a society, and will be far better able to give opportunities to our people to fulfill their aspirations. So I made a speech recently about companies. Companies is one entity that organizes our people, and I said, really at the end of the day, most companies call their people human resources, but people really go beyond a human resource. The people are at the heart of what we do, and they are the source of the energy and creativity of your company. That's why when we started the Earn and Learn program, I felt very passionately that beyond school, companies and bosses must take an interest in developing the people who are with them, who have thrown their lot in with them. So if we can do that, we can do a lot more things together. So those are the two things which I would say. And then you have all kinds of interesting creative surprises.
Minister, now that Heng Chi has opened the way for us to be more provocative, can I be intentionally provocative and ask you a question which has up to now not been particularly provocative nor controversial in Singapore, but clearly it has been internationally provocative at the social level, and that is LGBT rights. As we all know, the government's position here has been one of staying away from the whole debate on the grounds that this is an issue that involves religion, involves individual sexual orientations and preferences and so on, and it's not government's role to take a hard position, and that we need to let society evolve and government stays out of it. We also know that in the Western world, for many decades, this entire issue was very controversial. Nothing really moved, and you had government staying out of the fray. But we also know that in the space of less than 1 decade, the entire legal system changed in the Western world regarding LGBT rights, when it changed from an issue of individual preferences and social, moral, religious issues to an issue of basic human rights. And the debate, I guess the activists that led the way to LGBT rights becoming really recognized legally was when they changed the framework of the debate to one of human rights as opposed to individual orientation. I guess my question is, do you foresee that in the next 10 years, this international change from which we are quite different from, how long can we stay away from it before international activists turn this right into, international activists as well as local activists, turn LGBT issues from an issue of moral, social, religious, to one of basic human rights? And if that debate then becomes vociferous in Singapore, what would you do about it? What is your position on this?
Well, I think my position is not different from what we have articulated. Issues relating to values, relating to the stance that we take in particular things will evolve. And if you look at how Singapore has evolved over the years, there are many issues which were not discussed, but now more and more they are being discussed. And the younger generation will be subject to a very different set of influence. There will be many different points of view. And I think let me share one of the sessions in the OSC where this subject was actually discussed. And this was about what is the appropriate family structure. And what was interesting in that particular session was how when participants sat down and then face to face to talk about the issue, it was not as polarizing as it was, because here you have a human being in front of you talking about those issues and another human being in front of you advocating the particular issue. And I believe that that is a better way for us going forward, that essentially it is an issue which people would have to come together and say, well, let us talk about what this is all about. I don't think that, I can't predict how the international trends and norms will affect us. It will certainly affect us. How quickly, I don't know. But I do hope that the way that we deal with it will not be different from the way that we deal with issues that can potentially divide us, which is have a serious dialogue over a period of time on this, and then develop trust and understanding along the way, develop a better understanding of what is at stake, and then let it be resolved, rather than this is the way of dealing with it and there's no other way.
Do you foresee a possible decriminalization of Section 377A in the next 10 years?
Well, I cannot predict how things will change, but I think the stance at the moment is that we leave it as it is.
Yes, Bilari.
Okay, I want to ask a non-provocative question.
For you, that's not possible.
Unusual.
But before I do that, just to respond to one point that Kong Ping makes, human rights evolves, but it doesn't always evolve in one direction. You can see in Europe about rights of refugees, but that's by the by. I want to bring the discussion back, maybe, Minister, to this question about how we overcome the resistance which I think there is to this concept of our vulnerabilities. I agree with you, we'll just have to, all of us in our own ways, keep plugging away at it.
Right.
But one aspect of it is, I think, a knowledge of where we came from. I don't think, and this is my own view, we do a very good job of national education. We have elaborate apparatus for national education, but it is so ritualized that I sometimes wonder whether it does more harm than good. I don't think, and you were once Minister for Education, I don't think we do a particularly good job of teaching our own history to our young people. And the result is, I think, that there is a vacuum. And that vacuum has been filled with a whole lot of very dodgy history, a whole lot of rubbish. Now, do you agree with me?
That is a whole lot of rubbish.
There is a whole lot of rubbish being out there. Do you agree with me that this is a problem? And if so, how do we solve it? I know some things are underway, but by its nature, these things, we have probably lost a generation, in terms of historical education of our own history. But we have to start rectifying it somewhere.
Yes.
If that's a non-provocative question, I don't know what would be a provocative question from Bilahari.
I'll tell you later.
Thanks, Kwon Ping, for your kinship with me on this. And I tell you that Bilahari always crosses border when he goes at large. Bilahari, I'm so glad you asked that question, because I have never, since I went to MOE, and after I left MOE, I've never gone to any session of discussion or even a social function when somebody didn't say the root cause of the problem is education. And you have just kept my track record, so thank you very much, Bilahari. All I can say is that I'm quite happy that now I have two ministers who are my successors who are going to have to deal with this issue. Yeah. But seriously, I do think that there is a gap. There is a gap partly because we have been quite reluctant to talk about our history, because I know that MM in particular was very uncomfortable about talking about himself, and so he wrote the book for his memoirs and all that to help the younger people understand. But he didn't want to be seen, as glorifying himself, and as a result of which, I think the tone that was set was such that we are very reserved, say, in the way that we teach history, and I don't think that is a good thing.
You're right.
Rather, unfortunately, MM's passing that week of national mourning really created a national awakening. I had so many young people who came to the tribute event. Some wrote to me, and they said, I have never known, and I've not known about all these facts of our history, and how is it that we didn't teach it well in school? And when they saw, how Mr. Lee and his generation really had the steel in them to fight for a better life for all Singaporeans, and how they fight for a fair and just society, and they were really moved. And in fact, there are many parts of the history that we have not even properly collected. One of the most touching moments for me was during the tribute event in Tampines. I had a lady who came up to me and said that her father's dying wish, or rather not wish, her instruction to her was that if Mr. Lee passed on, she would have to attend the wake of Mr. Lee every day for as long as it is held. And she came every day. I saw her. So when she first told me that, I said, what did your father do? He said, my father was the security officer of Mr. Lee. My father saw Mr. Lee pushed into the drain by the communists, and risked his life. My father felt so deeply that that was a generation who really had risked their life and limb in order to build Singapore and in order to build a better life for all Singaporeans. My father reminded us that Mr. Lee could have been a successful lawyer working for the British and would have been rich and comfortable, but he chose otherwise. So stories like that we haven't even quite collected, and not much less to disseminate. So I fully agree with you. The question is, how do we do it in a way that does not come across that this is just propaganda?
Yeah.
And I do think that the way that our schools are beginning to teach it is a lot better. That I think we need to do it in a way that discuss those issues. I recently met a group of our students who were studying abroad, and I shouldn't name where they were studying. And they told me that, oh, gee, it's so different. As a secondary school student, when we did social studies, we were looking at two things in every source that were given: the reliability of the source and the accuracy of the source. For reliability, the students are taught, how do you know that this is a reliable source? Is there a bias there? Is there a particular angle that this person is trying to put to us? And for the accuracy of the source, the question that the students have to answer is, are there other sources that you can triangulate, that you can counter-check? And does this look reasonable to you? Do all the evidence add up? And if you look at our social studies question, it is of a very different nature. So I don't think we should be so reserved about this. I think we ought to do more.
Can I add to this, Minister? Because I have been on this refrain for a long time that we don't teach history well in school, and we tend to be a little shy about naming our leaders. When Mr. S. Rajaratnam passed away, many young Singaporeans did not know who he was. When Dr. Goh Keng Swee passed away, it got a little better, but still, he was not well known. And I think this is because our histories are written, maybe just mentioning them once or twice. They don't become full characters. There's no depth to the person and personality. And it's a pity because then you don't recall who your founding fathers are, who your leaders are. How do we overcome this? We have to teach history, objective history, which means you have to talk of Lim Chin Siong, you've got to talk about the PAP group, you see. And I think you can teach this, and you can teach this well. But I find that perhaps the government is a little defensive on this, because I remember once accompanying Minister DPM Teo Chee Hean, he was then Minister of Education, to schools in the United States. We went to the magnet schools, and we walked through the classrooms, and there were the US flags all in the front of the classroom. I said, Minister, I think this is a very good idea. Why don't we put a flag in our classroom in front of the students? The Americans teach patriotism that way. He said, oh, Heng Chi, if we did that, people will say it is propaganda. So I think, unfortunately, this is the way Singapore looks at things, but I feel that's a pity, because we should be patriots, we should love our country, we should appreciate our country, but we have to begin by appreciating our history and knowing who our leaders are and inserting their names. So the challenge is to the academics out there in this hall, and there are many of you, and some of you are historians, please write histories, and please write histories that are interesting to read. Thank you.
I would agree with all that you have said, Heng Chi, and I will make the same appeal to all our historians out there. Yes. I think we ought to be objective, but at the same time, we ought to inculcate this sense of this understanding of how Singapore started, why we started, and how did we arrive at where we are today. If we want to understand where do we need to go in the future.
Thank you. Perhaps just a last question from the floor.
2 minutes.
Thank you, Serena Pang, community arts activist and advocate. There was one word that has been said by all four speakers throughout this conference, and the word is trust. All four speakers have said it at one point or another. So, in the spirit of trust, with regards to contentious issues, be it LGBT, welfare, single mothers, equality, inequality, Minister, what is the one real pressure that is facing the government, rather than skirting around the issue and saying that time is a luxury, we can afford to let issues evolve? Could we just have a comment from you to say what is a real pressure facing the government from addressing some of the contentious issues? And that is in the interest of
Do you want to specify which contentious issues? Otherwise, we'll be here till tomorrow.
So specifically, it would be the LGBT issue, just the pressure facing the government, rather than, Dr. Ho is a gentleman, Mr. Ho is a gentleman, he asked the question, but he might not say what is the pressure. So from the side of, you have heard from outside, we want to hear from your side as well. What is the real pressure facing the government? And that's it. Thank you.
Well, I won't speak for the government per se. Let me give my own take on this set of issues. It is not so much the pressure, but rather it is how we see society coming together to come to agreements on matters which people disagree. Societies are very organic. It is not like a machine where you said, let me turn the dial and this is the direction, this is how you'll go, and let me turn the dial the other way and this is how everyone will accept. I have seen this even running public sector organizations. You cannot, even in the police force, tell the officers that, even when I was a very young cop many years ago, where you have, where command and control was the order of the day, that I have found that when people don't fully subscribe to what you say and what you believe in, the execution will always be very, very poor, and that you end up with all sorts of unintended consequences after you have made a decision. And you're talking about an organization where command and control is the norm. And over the years, as I run public sector organizations, as I discuss with many leaders of organizations about how things really change in your workplace, in your organization, without fail, it is that things change when people truly believe in it. And when people have very different views, even within the same organization, say that, well, let us come and debate this, and this is what we agree. We have to do things together, therefore let us agree to do this. And that quality of commitment to a decision makes a huge difference, both to the long-term future of the organization, as well as to the implementation of that decision. So it is not so much that we are trying to look at this and that and weigh up this. It is my personal conviction that if people really believe in what they are doing, if they find that there is that meaning in it, they find that this is the right thing to do, they will do it really well. If they don't believe in it, and you say, well, as I will by fiat decide this way or that way, those who disagree will come around to find other ways of either getting back or find other ways to destroy the decision. So it is, I hope that we as a society learn how to make decisions that affect everyone. And people will say, look, I want my children to be brought up this way, and others will say, I want my children to be brought up this way. So the issue will not just be for a day or two. It will be an issue that will go across generation. And I think that's why I talk about the quality of relationship. Because if you have that quality of relationship which is built on a deep understanding of our points of view, that I talk to you as a human being face to face, and that we come to some agreement, we have a far better quality of relationship that will transcend not just a specific issue, but will build that kinship that I spoke about.
And on that note, it's time for us to wrap up the conference. Can I invite the individual speakers just to say something quick and short, 30 seconds each. Prof. Chan first.
Amen.
Thank you all. It's time for a drink.
Ditto.
Heard a lot from Minister. Thank you very much. I'd like to now to invite IPS Director Jonas Devon to close off the conference. Thank you all for being a great audience.
Thank you. We've come to a very long day, end of a long day. We began at 8:45, it's now 10:15, so I think we have spent about 8.5 hours at this conference. Let me begin by first thanking our sponsors, to begin with Capel, our very long-term supporter, as well as the senders, NTUC Enterprise, Temasek, Wilma, and all the other entities that are listed on the backdrop here. So many of our sponsors are in fact repeat sponsors, and I'm very grateful for their support. I'd also like to thank the IPS staff who organized this conference. They slaved away for many weeks and months. All of them have not slept for the past 24 hours. Irene, Lynn, Hansen, Seling and Vani and all the rest. I'm very grateful to our four ministers, Mr. Heng Swee Keat, Mr. Ong Ye Kung, Mr. Ng Chi Meng, and Mr. Chan Chun Sing. It was, as they say, a big ask, and I'm grateful that you said yes. You may have regretted doing so, but thankful nevertheless. Also thank the panelists, not only the last panelists here that you have, but all the previous three, as well as all four of the chairs, Warren, Walter, Vikram, and Deborah. Deborah has done the past three IPS conferences, and she's promised to come back next year. Singapore Perspectives has become something of an institution, the major annual gathering devoted solely to our affairs, Singaporeans talking among themselves about themselves. And we take our responsibility seriously, and we try our best to put forward the best possible program to deserve your support. I think the session today substantially, if not wholly, accomplished what we set out to do, and I could only promise that we will try to repeat this next year and perhaps do better. So till then, thank you very much for your attendance, thank you for your participation, and good night.